Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alessandro Corda. I'm the director of the ICCJ at Queen's University Belfast. Welcome to the third installment of our ICCJ Invited Speaker Seminar Series for the 2021-2022 academic year. This afternoon, we are absolutely delighted to have Anita Lavorgna with us. Anita is an associate professor in criminology within the Department of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminology at the University of Southampton. She is also co-editor-in-chief of the state journal Criminology and Criminal Justice, which is, as you know, the official journal of the British Society of Criminology. Anita is, by all measurements, one of the rising stars of European criminology, and to certify that, she received the 2021 Early Career Award of the European Society of Criminology, which recognizes outstanding scholarly achievements. She has published extensively on the topics such as cyber harms and cyber crimes, misinformation and its propagation online, ethics and socio-technical approaches in online research and organized crime as well. Her latest book, Information Pollution as Social Harm, investigating the digital drift of medical misinformation in a time of crisis, was published by Emerald in 2021. Our talk today builds on this book and other projects Anita is involved in, and is titled Information Pollution as Social Harm in a Time of Crisis, a Socio-Criminological Perspective. The format will be the usual one, so our guest speaker will have around 40 minutes to present, and then we'll have 20 minutes left for the Q&As. So I invite everyone to turn off their microphones. And Anita, thank you very much again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Alessandro, for the amazing introduction. So let me share my screen. First of all, so we tried this before, so hopefully it will work. So now you should see a slide there. And thank you for inviting me. And as I told to you before, I just repeated to the audience. I just apologize for my voice if I'm not like 100%, but I was quite unwell yesterday, and I'm feeling better, but really not 100%. So I'll do my best. But please bear with me if there is a little bit of coughing here and there. So. You already introduced myself. I'm Anita Lavorgna, associate professor of criminology at the University of Southampton, and today I will be focusing on something that has to deal mostly with the pandemic by using a social harm approach. So let's start. Well, let's start with a little bit of an introduction here, in case you have not heard it, which I doubt. We went through a pandemic over the last bit more than 2 years by now. In my work, I'm considering this as a time of crisis, considering how it led to an unstable and uncertain situation affecting individuals, communities, and many societies alike. Of course, for sociologists and criminologists, it's not hard to imagine how this temporary, hopefully, but still socioeconomic revolution has had major effects as regards crime and deviance, challenges social scientists in general to study and interpret what was and still is an evolving context. So here in my presentation, again, mostly focusing on my book from last year, but then I will try to bring in some insight from other research carried out over the last couple of years. I will try to shed light on some social practices which I consider highly relevant from a criminological perspective, even if they have generally been overlooked by mainstream criminology. So these social practices that I'm interested in are mostly medical misinformation and similar practices. I'm conceptualizing this issue in the broader context of technology-facilitated social harms, and I am specifically interested in my work in the narratives and conversations that are taking place in self-identifying alternative lifestyle or counter-information online communities. So to explain a little bit more why medical misinformation and why this matter, I need to introduce a little bit the concept of information pollution and the pollution of medical information in particular. So I'm pretty sure that you all have noticed that in the unfolding of the pandemic, if you still remember what you were doing a couple of years ago, there has been like a flurry of information that has been published and widely disseminated. And this led to the building up a pile of relevant knowledge, of course, but also alongside the equivocal or deceiving news. To describe the situation, a lot of words have been used, such as like infodemic, or the concept of fake news has been used as well. But I personally don't like a lot this terminology because, for instance, infodemic is comparing the spread of bad or negative information as a sort of virulent, uncontrolled contagion. However, as I will be claiming later on in this presentation, the receivers of this information, they don't have a passive role as infected agents, as sort of infected objects of a sort of an external virus or agents, but actually they are a productive audience that actually has an agentic role in the production of misinformation. Also, the use of terminology such as fake news, I think, is quite reductive because it kind of suggests that there is a piece of information that has been like put there, like a false piece of information to willingly mislead someone. However, as we will see, the situation is far more complex. I don't know whether like luckily or not. So for all these reasons, you will see me using the notion of information pollution, which is a notion that actually was introduced a few years ago in political science. And this is a kind of a broader umbrella term that includes misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So misinformation is when false information is shared, but no harm is meant. Disinformation is when false information is knowingly shared to cause harm. And so this is more aligned, if you want, with the concept of fake news. And the malinformation is when actually genuine information is shared, but probably without giving the full context, so still in a kind of deceiving way, and this can cause harm. So polluted information, of course, can be of many types. As it has been, is a concept that has been started to be used, for instance, in political science, in political election, and things like that. But in my research, I'm focusing specifically, or more specifically, on polluted information that has to deal with health, and again, even more specifically, on that polluted information that is used to propagate non-science-based medical dis or misinformation. Before the pandemic, if you want the more classic example about this, was anti-vax misinformation, for instance, linked to childhood vaccinations and things like that. So why does it matter for criminologists, and why I claim that it can be looked through a social harm approach? Here, what needs to be said is that with very few exceptions, criminologists, at least in my view, have mostly overlooked the potentially dangerous non-science-based health practices as a topic of investigation. And this regards both some unquestionably illegal practices, so for instance, some cases of health frauds that are linked to this polluted information, but more in generally, the potential negative impact of this practice that these practices can have on vulnerable individuals, even when they don't meet any threshold of criminality. However, these practices and especially medical dis and misinformation, I claim that should deserve a fully fledged place within criminological imagination. And indeed, those are, in my view at least, perfect candidates to be considered to the social harm lenses, which, as we all know, is particularly promising as an approach in investigating events and activities that are taking place in those gray areas of legality when there is a misalignment between, for instance, a criminal law and harmful or potentially harmful antisocial behaviors, or where some of the harms might simply be hidden and something may just not be criminalized because we don't immediately recognize the harm, or we have not recognized the harm in the past. Here I need to open a brief parenthesis. which is, now I'm focusing on my research on the pandemic, but actually I started investigating medical misinformation and German practices since 2015, looking at media representations of these practices in Italian and British media, looking at creating a typology of offenders, and editing a multidisciplinary book with authors of all types of discipline, coming from like there's a physicist, we had people from medicine, health psychology, health sociology, a journalist, working together and trying to see and identify some of the harms. So when I say that, you know, some of the harms are there, it's actually a reflection that predates a little bit the pandemic. And actually, you know, fun story, when I will discuss this later on when discussing the methodology of my book. I was actually observing some of the community that I investigated for you know, my related projects when the pandemic started. So I was able actually to observe the start of the discussions and narratives since the very beginning. But I will cover this later on. And why these topics matter probably now more than ever. Of course, you know, something that I haven't mentioned before, probably it's kind of obvious, but information pollution is not something new. It's not something that is just limited to the digital realm. It's something that you know, probably was born together with medicine and with people disseminating like health information. There has been research, not in criminology, but for instance, there have been some studies carried out in the medical science or health psychologists since the 70s on, for instance, fake anti-cancer treatments or things like that. However, as you can imagine, in cyberspace and in our like digital age, the propagation of information has assumed like a new dimension online, and online is much easier to find like minded people to share view with, to gather all types of information. So again, it's not a new topic, if you want, it's just a topic that received a new urgency over the last decades or 15 years or so. So going back on track here, and on a criminological really like focus here. So what I'm claiming here in a way is that criminology and emerging so-called cybercriminology even more tended to focus on a limited range of core topics, often with a positivistic focus, especially the Anglosphere. In this context, a critical approach to what criminology is really, at the cost of stretching the discipline a little, can have the merit to shed light on form of crime and deviance that might otherwise be overlooked, even if they are capable of causing great suffering and harms. And again, as I was mentioning before, this is true particularly in cyberspace, whereas we know in cybercrimes research, the seriousness of many harms that are facilitated by digital means might be overlooked because some harms might, you know, not be easily recognized, even if they're very tangible and real for their victims. And as mentioned before, in the specific context of health-related information pollution, by looking at the harms, we can avoid this misalignment between criminal law and harmful and potentially harmful antisocial behaviors. What is the problem here? That many of the practices that we are encountering are not crimes per se, and probably we don't want to label them as crimes for some reasons that we'll be covering later on. Yet they cause severe harms, especially when we looked at the aggregated harms that these behaviors can cause online, and especially if we look at how some of these behaviors tend to be normalized in certain communities. So this is also a way to shed light on some of these hidden harms. However, again, it's really important that by looking at the issues that I'm looking through criminological lenses, I really don't want to suggest, and I really want to stress this, that the behaviors observed that I will be covering in the next slides should be criminalize. I'm just stressing that there is a need to better acknowledge the social and criminological relevance of those non-criminal yet harmful behaviors, even if this means to move beyond discussions on the allocation, for instance, of legal responsibility and better reflect on issues of collective, corporate, or even moral responsibility. Again, this is really looking beyond the legalistic aspects. So moving to the methodological approach employed, I just wanted again to clarify some key things that we will encounter later on. So as said, I will mostly focus on the book, but I will mention something also from other studies. So the premise, if you want, of the book is that in a context of increasing digital positivism, big data research methods and computational criminology when it comes to online research. With the book, I really wanted to stress the importance to retain a space for qualitative analysis of smaller data sets, focusing on more interpretative and critical approaches. So basically, I wanted, especially with the book, really to zoom in and look more closely at some of the online social networks that, for instance, computer scientists or data scientists looking at misinformation have identified in their work, so to scrutinize them more in detail. So my presentation here really mostly focuses on this book, which is based on a study that I carried out throughout the whole of 2020, especially in the unfolding of the so-called first and second waves of COVID in Italy and in many other countries in the European area. The methodological approach relies mostly on virtual ethnography, and this was complemented through a small number of narrative interviews with providers and propagators of polluted health-related information. As said before, it was a case of serendipity a little bit. I was already observing some of this self-defined alternative or counter information community for my research when the pandemic started. So I was already kind of observing this community since the early days when, I don't know if you remember back then, but there were this early news of a strange virus that was found somewhere in China, and then things arrived in Italy, and then from Italy to other countries, etc. And it was very interesting to also observe these early stages of the narratives. But we will discuss this in a moment. However, the main arguments of the book that I will present today have been at least partially tested and actually further developed through some parallel and later work that I carry out in the last couple of years, where I looked with the more mixed method approaches, so actually bringing together also some computational approaches. Well, I actually mix network analysis and thematic analysis, looking at large subsets of Twitter datasets, and in these other studies, they were pivoting around the narratives used by those opposing the track and trace NHS app in the UK. And this is in a report that is freely available from the website of my university. And now we are concluding, and hopefully we're submitting sometime by the end of the month mid-April, let's hope, some a study pivoting about the use of the no mask or anti-mask narratives in the course of the pandemic, also based on two data sets, one actually in the 2020 and the newest data sets looking at kind of large big Twitter data, let's say in early 2022, with the release of the restrictions in many countries. So this, when it comes to the method, when it comes to the kind of more theoretical approach that I have been using, of course, then it really depends on the specific studies, but overall, my work is trying to integrate socialization approaches, and specifically the recent adaptation of Matz's ideas with the digital drift concept with cultural approaches. And by saying that, again, there is another small parenthesis that I need to open here. I really want to stress that only a minority of the behaviors encountered in my work can be easily considered not only as criminal, but also as deviant. So it might be strange for some to use, theoretical approaches that traditionally look at like deviancy and criminality to look at something that is actually different. And again, I cannot really consider most of the things I study as deviant, if only because that would imply a sort of sufficient level of societal consensus around science-based approaches, or at least a recognized value of science in society, which unfortunately it seems like lacking from what we've been observing over the last 2 years. And again, some of the behaviors observed are actually quite normalized and definitely are not considered as deviant between their community of reference. It's really difficult to classify them against the norm. Actually, they are the norm for many groups online. However, because of the potential or actual harm they can contribute to, I still think that theories of deviance can offer a precious help here in unpacking some important behavioral dynamics. So what is problematic is really the normalization in cyberspace of some of these behaviors because of the individual, familiar, or like broader social harm that they can cause. So having said all this, I think it's time to start presenting a little bit of the results. So first, so for the next few minutes, I want to present and say something about the actors I've encountered in my studies, categorizing them as providers, so those who are actually actively involved in offering non-science-based health approaches, supporters or propagators, so those who proactively support one or more providers, becoming themselves an important source of information pollution, and finally receivers or utilizers. So those are those actors who belong somehow to a certain online group, but they are mainly there as bystanders or have overall a quite limited role. In the next few slides, I will say something for each of them. But here, what I really want to stress with this kind of scheme provided here is the kind of drift mechanism, a sort of like visual summary of the drift mechanism through which they escalate in promoting and creating polluted information. So if we imagine, sorry, if you imagine to place the extent of digital drift along a sort of continuum, as in this image, so these different categories of actors are to be progressively placed in different parts of this continuum. The further they're positioned along the continuum in a way, the more their presence in online health-related discourses is shaping their identity. So advancement through this continuum is generally prompted by what I call the catalyst event that is pushing or pulling individuals further, changing the equilibrium in the drift. So in other words, these positions are reflecting a different degree of involvement and attachment that is associated to their online participation. Some individuals are or will become, as an effect of a catalyst event, more invested than others in certain online discussions and online communities. And as such, this becomes kind of indicative of this digital drift. So let's cover a little bit something about this more in detail about the receivers, supporters, and providers, but please try to keep this kind of image in mind while I go in the next through the next few slides. So receivers, quite quickly here, receivers are really the silent majority here. They tend to be bystanders. So let's imagine, you can imagine a sort of, I don't know, large Facebook group with, I don't know, 1,000 people enrolled in it. Actually, you will have, I don't know, about 70% or even 80% of people that are actually just there. They may, put a like here and there, share. They're not really actively participating. Still, they can, they receive this information, of course, and they share it outside of the group in many cases. So what is important to say here is that these people are absolutely different, and in terms of age, gender, educational status, etc. So these groups tend to be quite diverse, and depending on what is quite like interesting is that there is not really a real, let's say, subculture here that can be identified that is actually propagating this information. And this was probably even, better clarified through the Twitter data sets. What we're really observing is that we have a range of people that are somehow attracted towards certain online groups, pages, forums, hashtags, or whatever can be a sort of like clustering place or events online because of one specific interest. This specific interest could actually be, I don't know, children education, children vaccination, curiosity about something, willingness to know more about COVID, willingness to know more about something else, a political belief, for instance. So there is like a very diverse constellations, if you want, of themes that in a way, through some of these online groups, find a sort of convergence in some key points of the narratives. We will cover this more in detail later on. Bringing people together within certain groups, certain hashtags, certain something online, with people then moving from one place to another and kind of creating this kind of loose community, loose collective, but still a collective with like-minded people under like many aspects. But again, if you look at the specific individuals, they are completely like different and diverse there. Definitely, they don't recognize themselves as potential victims. They consider themselves as a very strong agentic actor that actually willingly went into a specific place or start interacting with certain people, looking for something, looking for information, etc. What is the danger here for them is that the type of information, so dangerous information that they take online, that they receive, they could use it for themselves and like hurting themselves and creating harm to themselves, to their family, to their beloved ones, or by spreading, just think about like a share button or retweet button, this type of information to the wider community. Just to give like a better sense of what type of information we are discussing here, of course, should have mentioned this before, some that I was taking for granted, but it's better to clarify. It's really about everything, from a very serious thing, like if you are sick, you should not go to the hospital, they would just like poison you with medicine, you should just take bleach instead at home, so very, very, very like harmful and serious things. About taking a harmful substance or not taking a medicine when needed, actually, to opposing and reinforcing this opposition to instruments of how to say, of health control, such as the use of masks, vaccinations, etc., to how to say, actually creating events where people would actually how to say, meet to exchange and take the virus or things like that. So there is really a broad range of things here, but still it's about like potentially more or less dangerous information that is then spread elsewhere. From a criminological perspective, I think that actually supporters are of great interest here because of their like ambivalent role. They tend to be both victims and offenders. If you remember in our kind of like drift kind of like scheme, there was been a catalyst event for them, something that actually made them move from being just some receivers to being something more. They become very active in this community, generally because they went through a traumatic event, and this is identifiable through the self-narratives that these people employ online. So these people tend to talk about themselves online quite a lot. They discuss about their their past, and this information was then complemented with some interviews, as I said before. These people, again, as I was saying, went often through a sort of like traumatic something. This could be a sort of like illness in the family, or their own illness, or some type of like dissatisfaction at work. And they are basically looking for something different, something more. That can be some extra hope when it comes to health, or it can be a sort of like a social validation for their ideas. And they enter more and more this type of groups, again, very heterogeneous. The difference here is that these persons who, again, might be victims themselves, for instance, they might be victim in some extreme cases, victim of frauds, with actually the actual provider taking a lot of money, for instance, for them to buy some fraudulent products or things like that. However, they become somehow the offenders themselves, actively propagating, creating new content in this propagation of polluted or very negative information. Quite interesting here is that we observe some hierarchies within some groups, because as we will see, some supporters are then becoming providers, and when they are supporters, in a way they are creating a sort of professional network and professional identity. So there is a sort of like shift in the role of supporters. Some of them will just stay there, supporters. Some of them will start taking contacts, creating like a real network, starting promoting themselves through the network of other providers, and then they will start becoming providers themselves. So what are providers? Providers, again, can be of different types, and in this study, actually, I was able to test and prove that it holds quite well a previous typology that I created with a colleague a few years ago. So some of these providers can be utilitarian providers. They're really looking for profits, and this is linked to many cases of frauds where information, polluted information, is actually created so that providers can actually have a financial benefit, for instance, which is selling their products, selling their books, be invited for money to give seminars and conferences or things like that. Some of them are so-called custodial providers, which is some of them are actually in good faith, meaning that they are really trying to help people. It's just that they don't realize that they are saying or like promoting information that is completely in contrast with all the scientific evidence that as like society we have so far, or so-called egoistical faith, meaning that they are still, let's say, in this position to help the others, but this is mostly to reinforce their own, their own ego and, a strong identity. So they see themselves as those helping the others. They see themselves as, for instance, alternative doctors or things like that. And this is really about, pushing and cooling their professional identity. There were cases of sexual abusers that were found in the past, but again, in this case, it was difficult to prove in the cases that I observed for the book, so I will just skim through it. And delusional providers, people who unfortunately are likely to have some mental health problems. They are quite delusional in their writing and in what they say. People like, discussing about receiving medical training through trips in astral dimensions and things like that, but still then giving medical advice to people that are actually following their guide rather than going to the doctor or to the hospital or whatever. Their declared motivations, of course, are always very, very positive. Many of them have web pages, a lot of details in the Facebook groups or online communities that they try to create, etc. So actually, it's quite easy to find a lot about their past or things like that. And when interviewed, they tend to be quite chatty. They really like to talk about themselves. So of course, their declared motivations are always extremely positive about like helping others, etc. However, reading in between the lines or like looking for what they charge for every single things they do, the search for financial profit is definitely there. Just to give you like a fun example, there was one of these let's say alternative doctors and researcher that actually was quite unfortunately notorious in Italy in the midst of the pandemic, someone that is completely discredited by the all scientific medical communities as a quack. Basically in his website, this person has a specific page dedicated to what he charges for like every event is asked to participate to, giving details also of the type of room that he wants to have at the hotel, the type of food that he wants to have, specifying that he agrees to go and speak to these like events only if he's like the only one invited. He doesn't want to engage in debates with other experts or things like that. So the search for financial profits is definitely there, and quite interesting, especially for is the different degree of education and training that we have here. So if one side we have people that, for instance, are former doctor that then, for instance, were disbarred because they started propagating not like science-based medicine, but like alternative, like non-science-based ideas, to people with a kind of scientific background. So for instance, people with a degree in biology that then decide to improvise themselves as doctors. We have like yoga teachers. We have like really all type of different degrees. What is kind of like scary from a societal point of view is that you really need to dig quite a lot into information to try to understand what type of background these people have. From an outsider, from someone is actually searching for help, searching for information online. They all appear the same. They all present themselves as experts. They all present themselves as like trustworthy people with expertise in health and medical information. Now, this expertise could have been like developed in years through kind of like weekend masters for payment, where they just receive like a piece of paper like printed in someone's house with a signature. Again, someone was mentioning about like some astral training received, so the type of education and training that this person received. Just think about also the type of they're really discussing sometimes about like a quite serious health issue. It's quite problematic in my view. So now that we have looked at some of the key aspects of those actors, I really want to focus on what brings them together and help us explaining the truth, which is really how they understand and build knowledge. And here, of course, I will have to move a little bit beyond what is like strictly like the criminology. So taking a lot of literature from colleagues from communication science, for instance, and psychology. So first of all, we have to say that conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy-led narrative were widely observed and described in all the studies carried out, especially in the ethnography, but also in the Twitter data sets. As you can imagine, during the pandemic, there was this kind of like a lot of like QAnon-related stuff, of course, but really a lot more. The fact is that conspiratorial thinking of pseudoscience historically have always been very close since actually the Cold War culture of the 1950s. And however, to understand why the pandemic provided such a fertile soil to conspiracy belief, I think it's really important to look at individual and group attitudes and behaviors. So conspiratorial thinking, and this is something that is again broadly studied by other disciplines, is something that thrives in situations when people need to feel safe and secure in their own world, and to exert control over their existence is somehow threatened. As the conspiratorial thinking is something that helps individuals' feelings of agency and power. So in a way, it's also a way to relieve individuals from a sense of responsibility for what they perceive as a disadvantaged position. And also when group members experience a sort of like a relative deprivation or competitive victimhood, to bring us closer to criminological concepts. And they basically end up believing that their in-group is not given the same opportunities as the out-group, or that their in-group somehow endured more suffering and injustice than the out-group. So conspiracy belief can find a solid basis to grow. And it was very clear, especially from the ethnography, that especially active participants in the communities were really considered, considering themselves as suffering an injustice for, especially around the time of the catalyst event as identified before. So why does this matters for really how they build knowledge? So social psychologists have shown that even if conspiracy theories are often presented by their supporters as something rational in nature, they are rather a reflection of certain beliefs about the world, which are really a result of a multi-biased information-seeking process. What is really present in all the studies is that the epistemic authority of modern science is really challenged because of its alleged dogmatism, the presence of vested interests in scientific knowledge production, and the exclusion of lay knowledge by scientific experts forming a sort of a global elite. As a reaction to this, epistemic mistrust, science-related populism has over time proposed some alternative epistemologies, which can be really summed up in a sort of attempt to replace established knowledge with different but still scientific, in a way, counter knowledge, or by replacing it to core with the common sense, personal experiences, and gut feeling, promoting a sort of enhanced role of emotion in decision makings. So this is really an alternative and experiential knowledge building process, where initial opinions, beliefs, or even self-diagnosis are just confirmed and strengthened by communal peer reinforcement in these groups. So social ties and these online networks or communities through peer reinforcement have done a strong impact on health practices and individualist epistemologies by really boosting individual confidence in their experiential knowledge. So in this context, what I could observe is that information is really denied or dismissed on the basis of mechanisms such as confirmation biases, misguided bias, and belief perseverance. Again, this kind of like epistemic biases that have been long studied by in psychology of health or social psychology. So again, just really to stress how it's important for criminologists, I think, to open up to other disciplines to have a kind of like broader understanding of what really is at stake here. I still have, I will go over for 5 minutes if I can, Alessandro.
Sure, absolutely.
Is that okay? Okay, sorry, just to lose track a little bit of time. So just to conclude, despite the heterogeneity of the participants observed, I wanted to stress in this final part of the presentation some major underlying themes and narrative frames that could be identified. These themes and frames has I just briefly mentioned earlier on in this presentation are pushing quite diverse but still converging and compatible discourses, and in this way they are really facilitating socialization with what are perceived as like-minded people by structuring intragroups attitudes and beliefs, but also facilitating their engagement with a larger audience. And I think this is really the basis of the success of a certain type of polluted information. So for instance, online identities are carefully built through an interplay of tensions and dichotomies, crafting social imaginaries or imaginaries of the self that can be very diverse if taken singularly, but are still connected by some major converging themes. So, for instance, even if, as said before, we cannot distinguish a specific or clearly defined subculture, we can still notice how a behavior of individuals observed is really linked to the group social identity, being more than a simple collection of individuals behaving en masse. Individuals are indeed influenced by group identity, for instance, by being motivated to protect and enhance the positivity of the group, to establish a positive in-group status or in-group distinctiveness, so to protect and enhance their own self-esteem and not just the group. So the frames that I've observed are those informing the so-called narrative of the selves, and these are really pivoting around the image of themselves, such as experts, belonging, or free libertarian, that the participants that I observed want to project to others, and which are at the basis of their online socialization. There are also other narrative frames, however, that I just skip here because of lack of time. Yeah, so I just skip here. Discussing about these narrative frames that are commonly found, but that are responding, if you want, in a subtler way to participants' use of the social media groups to find not only support and reassurance among like-minded people, but also a sense of agency and of control over their lives. In a way, for these individuals, online interaction, are becoming a fundamental tool to allow their agential self to further practices of freedom, ethics of self-care, and to borrow Foucault's words, a self-oriented morality. And I really think this is pivotal for us if you want to understand why certain misinformation is so popular and successful. So the narratives offered are not just persuasive, but they're really restorative to some of these individuals because they're enabling participants to find a renewed sense of self and purpose and almost a sense of social justice. So to conclude really here and to like bring everything hopefully together of what I said, my study tried to start a criminological or further a sociological approach to pandemics, trying to focus on some sociocultural processes that are enabling and sustaining the propagation of potentially harmful mis or dis or malinformation during the pandemic. These topics, again, I fully recognize are not traditional or mainstream criminological ones. However, I hoped that I have argued sufficiently that criminology should really consider this within its academic jurisdiction because of the social harm that these behaviors allow, even if this means going a little bit beyond the boundaries of our discipline. The analysis of the main characteristics and roles of providers, supporters, and receivers, and how they build their identities and system of beliefs through their different drifting in and out, medical misinformation. I think this is helpful to shed some light around some core online socialization mechanisms that are at the base of the propagation and success of polluted information, which means that, for instance, in order to disrupt or possibly prevent potentially harmful dis or misinformation through better designed, framed, or targeted science-based information and public health communication, then it becomes absolutely important the identification of the prevalent and converging narrative frames and of the epistemological mechanisms that are at the basis of the misinformation that we are witnessing. Otherwise, we are just doing intervention, as unfortunately we have seen, at least in Italy during the pandemic, blasting people without really understanding what's at stake there, how certain socialization mechanisms are working with interventions that actually can just radicalize almost people more and more and bring a sort of like polarization at the extreme rather than intervening in a positive way. And of course, this is an online harm for me from a criminological perspective. And as it happens for all, I would say, types of online harms, there is no single best strategy for prevention and control here. It's really about looking for a concerted, multi-layered effort between disciplines, institutions. But I think that I hope this is like a step in the right direction. I'm sorry I spoke 5 minutes more than I was supposed to, but I just close it here. And thanks. Those are just some of there were some visual analysis in my work as well. Those are just some like random pictures from the analysis, and I just like stop sharing.
So thank you very much, Anita. This has been like an extremely interesting, thoughtful presentation. I took a lot of notes. I would have, a lot of questions. I would like to invite my dear great colleague Amanda Kramer, whom I asked to offer some perspective. So Amanda, I made you a presenter. So thank you so much again, and Amanda will help us, springboard the discussion. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or type a question in the chat box. Thank you so much. Please, Amanda, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thanks, Alessandro. Thank you so much, Anita, for that talk. It was really fascinating, and I think probably one of the most attractive parts of your research is that, this has impacted almost everybody, even people who maybe don't necessarily think of this as being in the category of social harm. It's something that we've all been experiencing. Most of us have people in our own lives that have fallen into the categories that you've identified as being receivers or supporters or providers. So I think probably, some of the appeal of this work is that it really does touch all of this. And I think in a way that it never really has, to the scale before, that the pandemic has brought out this, I guess, like a wider scale of people engaging in this type of misinformation that we have never really seen, or maybe hasn't been as mainstream as it is now. I think, your reflections in relation to the harm that this causes, also, it's very real. We can all see how, people not taking on medical advice and instead going off of these off of this information that is peddled by people that is grounded in misinformation, like not taking vaccines or not taking proper treatment protocols when they are ill, or not taking the necessary preventative strategies like physical distancing and wearing masks and all of these things. So I think, the harm that this causes, the potential harm that this can cause, is very real. And I think, bringing it in under the umbrella of semiology, bringing it into criminology, when we think about the scale that these types of activities, the scale of harm that they can cause, it's on par with a lot of other behaviors that we would consider to be deviant or criminal. And it kind of links us back into that classic debate of things like, the harm that these types of behaviors cause, would arguably be more than something like property damage or, like these very mild forms of deviance that are brought into the criminal justice system. So I think there's so much there, that we can unpack, and there's so many things to think about. And I really thank you for your contributions. I guess maybe one of the things that, if I can abuse my position and ask you a question, in terms of responses, I suppose there's always this concern, particularly amongst critical criminologists, of, bringing more behaviors into the remit of the criminal justice system and dealing with these things as crimes. I think I was just wondering if you could reflect on the solutions, and whether you think that part of these solutions should be coming from the criminal justice system, or you think that, I know you said we need, multi-layered responses. Do you envision part of this response as coming from the criminal justice system?
Okay, well, thank you for everything you said, and as you said, I mean, I think that touches the nerves for a lot of people, and it was, I would say, like painful because as everyone, I think, I also had like people close that was really like falling for this type of things, and so it was like in terms of like researchers' reflectivity, if you want, quite painful at times, but this is life and research, right? As it comes to your question. I would say, like, I hope at least that criminal justice, it's not something to be involved here, meaning that I see that really as a sort of like extreme ratio. And I mean, some of these things are not criminal, and I see a big, huge problem, if you want it. Even if I fully recognize how harmful they are, I really see a big problem in trying to criminalize them, because it's really about freedom of speech, of opinion, and when you touch upon these things online, I mean, I really don't want to go there. Let's put it in this way. I think that there are like so many other things that can be done. First of all, some of these extreme cases are nothing else but cases of frauds. We already have instruments to, without having to invent the wheel or to, trying to put more limitations to online speech and things like that to intervene. The fact is about intervening. I can tell you a little bit more in detail about the Italian, a little bit of UK case, but probably the Italian even more, because I've done a lot of research on this topic on like Italian groups and cultures in my previous research. And for instance, I'm thinking about some of these, the doctors or like previous doctors that are propagating like terrible information. Some of my past research was about anti-cancer treatments, for instance, and people telling people, to cool themselves with sodium bicarbonate, rather than taking a chemo, things like that. And, the harm is kind of there, right? The problem is that it's very difficult for this case to emerge, because the victims very often don't recognize themselves as victims unless it's too late, basically. and it's they are they're really and sometimes there are attempts by some of members of the family, for instance, to go against some of these individuals, but sometimes it causes a lot of strains also within the family, because someone actually is kind of still thanking these doctors because they have hope in the treatment. They just think it's a case of bad luck, etc. So also here, what are the instruments? Some of these people have been disbarred too late by the doctors' organizations. They've been like silent too long. Now this seems to be a little bit better, but again, it's a, if someone is selling this treatment like for 10 years, you cannot intervene kind of like long harm there. Or about media communication about this topic. So in the UK, actually, it's better than in Italy, but in Italy it's completely terrible because there is like no media distinction about the the harms. But also in the UK, you're wondering if these people are actually invited in public settings, giving them a sort of how to say, I'm missing the word here, kind of like what's the word? Alessandro, you can help me when translate a sort of like a
platform,
acceptance, like a sort of endorsement. Yeah, I was looking for endorsement. Sorry, I found the word myself. For like inviting them to speech sometimes like in the parliament or in like some town halls or things like that. All this stuff. If more attention was done on the kind of like communication, I really think that a lot of like harms would actually be limited. And intervening and too strongly, it's really about creating a sort of displacement or a lot of these activities. So that's the other thing. You really want to go and reach and alert in a more targeted way vulnerable victims, and by intervening too harshly. And this has been seen during the pandemic, when some of these behaviors were getting kind of attention, and some like online vigilantes went into this group trying to shout at them, to debunk them, etc. Simply they move on Telegram, and it was so much more difficult just to try to reach and provide good information to these people. So that's why I think it's absolutely not about hoping for more criminalization. It's really about my hoping for more awareness raising, better targeted intervention, and more knowledge about the topic. I don't know if this answer to your query, or I see that there is a question in the chat. Should I answer that? You're on mute, Alessandro. I see you.
Here I am. So I regained my voice just like a receiver. So now I'm becoming a propagator of questions. So Kevin Harty asks, so very interesting talk and project. I wonder if the discussion from a social harm semiology perspective goes beyond just disinformation / misinformation / malinformation, though to relate more broadly to all information in times of public health crisis. So can we go beyond the medical misinformation to embrace and include in the analysis other types of information?
I would say absolutely yes. So of course, just that, like everything is information, and I could not possibly look at everything. So I look specifically like health, and like my definition for mis or disinformation was really everything that was against science, which of course, just to clarify, because I have not clarified it before, there can be like in science, in research, there are debates. So especially in like emerging issues like a new virus or things like that. So of course, if there was like a sort kind of like solid debates, for me that is not mis or disinformation, it's just part of how research works. However, there were some things that were completely, like biologically implausible and completely considered absolutely non-scientific, but the whole scientific community in that case for me was not science-based. Just to make a sort of clarification, because of course there were a lot of debates of what was going on, the severity of the virus, etc. But if a new phenomenon, and you need time to understand that. However, I fully agree. There have been a lot of harmful information coming from governmental bodies, coming also from the World Health Organization, or like I would say misleading information, which from one side can be kind of, I don't know, at least in my opinion, personal opinion, like kind of excused because it's a new phenomenon. From the other side, of course, at least I'm thinking about in Italy. You might remember Alessandro, Bergamo is running, Milano is running, etc. So basically there were like some measures of some like big Italian cities. Actually, that was the part that was actually most hit more badly by the virus at the beginning. That at the beginning of the, where restrictions were starting, they were actually actively promoting things online to keep the city open, to avoid any type of restrictions, etc. And I mean, yes, to me, there is a responsibility there. There is definitely a harm that was caused there. I've decided, just because I needed to focus on something, not to look also this type of behaviors, but definitely there was a lot of like problematic information there, at least that it comes a precaution principle. I will say, I'm thinking about, think about the different indications that were given. If you just go and backtrack, the World Health Organization information on the use of mask at the beginning, and what then was available later on as information was piling up, and we knew why they were important, etc. It's kind of I mean, definitely there is a lot to look in from a social harm perspective also there. It was just a matter of like choice for me to focus on this specific aspect. I don't know if this
Kevin followed up saying, I'm thinking here of the idea of infobesity. Too much info then is good or healthy for us. So yeah.
I think that it as a kind of concept, there is a matter of, I think that is related to this concept of like of malinformation, right? So actually you can also like give some, let's say, scientific, accurate information, but in a way that actually can cause harm, because for instance, you receive too much of it and you are not able to process it as a doctor will do. So you kind of, are overwhelmed by some of this information, or the other way around. So I think that as a kind of like basic concepts, of course, it can be expanded way beyond to, the kind of like pandemic or like cancer related misinformation that I've been dealing with my work.
So I have a short question. I see that Teresa is writing a question in the chat box, but meanwhile, okay, no, here we have Teresa. So interesting talk. One question on the notion of drifting. So the term suggests that people will go back to norms at some point, but what about debates about conflict in society as a result of these divisions? And how much of this is due to technology? Okay,
that's a really interesting question. So, I mean, it's really for me about like people going like on and off. So the fact is that think about some of the how to say notions that are generally used when we discuss about polarization of ideas and information in social media, such as like filter bubbles, echo chambers, etc. With the idea of drift, I think that what I was really trying to do here was really try to show that actually those groups, those networks are not so closed. It's not that they kind of live there, they are a subculture, they don't live in a bubble and that's it. They actually drift out different types of information. It's just that something happens at some point, so that kind of like, let's say, like attract them, right? Like more in one direction rather than, keeping them on a kind of more balanced track. Some people just, it's like, one might, for fun read horoscopes in a journal, but might not decide, to follow every single thing that read in the horoscope, right? It's something like that. Some might just, read something or take, an herbal tea or something like that as, self-care or like wellness, etc. But some people are really like kind of like drifted in a direction that becomes problematic for their health rather than just, a matter of like self-care and wellness. So for me, it was most about like, how to say, showing that actually this is not about like a isolated bubble that you can algorithmically tackle, like let's distract, let's bomb the kind of that specific network, etc., and the problem disappears, because it's a kind of people going there and drifting in a certain direction because of specific social needs. So I think that what I was really trying to show here is the complexity behind. And yes, there are conflicts in society as a result of these divisions. And I think that they are not really due to tech, they're just probably exacerbated by tech. But again, I really think that is also because of how we try to tackle them. So quite interesting. If you look at information on published research, okay, of disinformation, misinformation, etc., is mostly done by computer and data scientists. Again, I work with them in some of my projects, so I love them, I have nothing against them, just to clarify, but they have a completely different take, okay? It's about retaining a space for us as social scientists and fighting for retaining that place in looking at qualitatively also at the complexity of things rather than just how to say like giving up to like kind of algorithmic choices here, because when it going back to your question and how much this is due to tech, I think this is mostly due to how to say technical rather than socio-technical use of texts and interventions, meaning that if you look about like the proposed solutions to tackle this problem, generally it's about you know, filtering certain contexts or making more you know, difficult to access certain contexts, but the content is there. You have not really went to the root of the problem. You're just about like displacing the problem, and this I think leads to furthering this type of us versus them, in group versus out group dynamics that I tried at least very quickly, sorry, to mention before, and this can actually worsen polarization and the societal divisions rather than actually trying to find a kind of bridge that can intervene in rebalancing the drifts. I don't know if this makes sense. I said the idea that everyone can be an expert on tech. I'm not sure that I got this latest question. Can be an expert on tech. That I'm not really sure that that I got the last point. Can you clarify that? I'm just reading the chat.
There is a nice comment from Shad. That I saw that there was one more question in the making. I have like one very brief point, and then we are really running out of time. So I find very compelling your framework about the fluid continuum between, you know, the different figures. And I think that like receivers are really kind of the soft belly of the beast to a certain extent, because I think that you unpack very well that they're not just ignorant. I mean, we tend to dismiss them as just ignorant. So that's why they are the weak, you know, chain link. It's more about that, I think, and I would like, you know, a brief answer on this. It's not just about, as you said, like their ignorance, that they are willing to absorb anything that would come their way, but it's also about this idea of reclaiming a voice, to find their voice. Yes. And to a certain extent, I think it's very interesting that they're not aware necessarily that they are being victimized, even in a non-formally, you know, criminal legal way. But to what extent do you think that at least some of them, they are willing to be victimized to a certain extent, if they can trade this to become relevant, to find their own voice and have a role that, in a world of traditionally conceived experts, they wouldn't have in any way?
I think that's like a brilliant point, and I would say some probably yes. Again, there is a bit that, again, heterogeneity also in the receivers as before, and it's really they have like all range of motivations to be there, from curiosity to being like desperate in looking for hope. So I think that the kind of like generalization there is difficult to do. That's why I was really like mentioning this issue about like targeted intervention, because it's really like you cannot have a one size fits all with this type of communities. Definitely, there are some people that really this is like super clear from interviews or from part of the ethnography. They want to be heard, most of all. Okay, they feel you know, they might have something going on personally, okay, something going on at work, something going on like in general. They feel in a sort of like relative deprivation, if you want to use the kind of like a criminological thing, compare to other people in society. They feel injustice towards them because, for instance, they didn't manage to, you know, do something or reach a certain position that they wanted to reach, etc. So for them, having, you know, a kind of like agency in their life, and you know, just, you know, I do what I want. There was this one of the, I didn't have time to linger on that, but basically the main transversal theme that was there like throughout the studies was really this theme of freedom. Freedom could be from the government, from big pharma, from the school teacher, you know, freedom for whatever you want, from, you know, the supermarket boss telling you to wear a mask, but still it's about freedom. This is my body, and this is like a choice that I'm taking with my agency on myself. itself. So this is really kind of the key concept for some of these people. So here I think it's more about making sure that these people feel that they are heard. And for instance, well, I didn't have time to cover this in detail, but for instance, in health communication studies, a lot has been published on the role of like GPs or medici di base on and how they should communicate to patients, and how they should be actually the first contact points of to make sure that people can feel listened. And it has been kind of proven already that is like probably the best thing to avoid then people falling this type of misinformation. But then if you see about like budgets allocation and the, I think, issues and strengths of GPs or medici di base in both UK and in Italy lately, where you just have to wait, I don't know, like 2 months to get an appointment, or they cancel appointment because they don't have staff, they don't have time, etc. So again, before going towards criminalization, I think that resources should definitely be allocated in other directions. I hope this answers your question a bit, Alessandro.
Totally. So we are really running out of time. Okay. Teresa is still typing. Again, I think that this has been a absolutely fascinating talk, and it's clear that there is so much more to come from Anita and hopefully many other researchers who will become excited about this line of inquiry, because again, as you have shown us today, it's clear that there is so much to be investigated from different perspectives, and there is so much more to be unpacked, and I think that you're being a trailblazer here. So thank you so much again for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
thank you
yes,
for inviting me. And again, if there are other questions, you have my email, so just drop me a line.
We will, and I'm sure that it's been a fantastic opportunity for many of us to be exposed to this new line of research, which is not, again, traditional criminology, but I think that when you say that, we are expanding the galaxy, which is an expression I'm very fond of. So Anita, thank you so much, and thanks so much to all participants, and very special thanks to Amanda for acting as the discussant today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye, thank you. Have a nice evening.